Humans have a very deep and legitimate need to belong. This is one of the reasons why the parable of the lost sheep feels so powerful to us, why it resonates with us. We have a deep need to identify with something in this huge cosmos, to understand ourselves as unique and special in some way, and to understand ourselves as worthy of love, worthy of belonging, worthy of being sought out by something or someone. This is our launch pad. Everyone needs and deserves a launch pad of belonging. And yet many of us today are feeling lost. Lost within broken relationships, lost within a story that feels broken politically, economically, environmentally. Stories that have very little to do, or seem to have very little to do, with a sense of belonging. Instead, we feel a cultural model that seems bent on trashing our natural environment, giving money to an exclusive group and excluding billions of others, that tends to sort us into winners and losers, and then blames the losers for not being winners. How does this make sense within our need to belong? I recently heard a TED Talk by the author George Monbiot, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, that asked some of these same questions, and I am going to use his framework for much of what I say this morning. I'm shamelessly borrowing from a TED Talk. I want you all to know that this morning. He reminds us that stories are a primary way in which we can navigate our world. That stories give us a place to belong. We have family stories, religious stories, congregational stories, regional stories, maybe even stories as a world citizen. And these stories shape who we are as individuals and as citizens of a larger group. And he reminds us, Monbiot reminds us, that if we want to make sense of something, we actually tend not to turn to facts and figures. We turn to stories. We turn to good stories. A good story is one that reflects the way that we humans and the world behave, or the way we think it should behave. A good story hangs together as a particular narrative. It is a recognizable narrative structure. There are many different narrative structures, but the one that I want to talk about this morning is one that is often used by politicians. It's called the restorative story. It's a particular narrative, the restorative story, or the restoration story, either one. And it goes something like this. Disorder afflicts the land, and it is being caused by a powerful and nefarious force working against the interests of all humanity. But the hero will revolt against this disorder by fighting those forces, and against all odds, we will ensure that those forces are overthrown so that harmony restores to the land. That's a political story. You've heard this story before, not only from our politicians, but you've heard it. It's the Bible story. It's the Star Wars story. It's the Harry Potter story, right? Because it's familiar and it resonates with us, it is a powerful story. Rage against the machine, but the machine keeps changing, and the heroes, therefore, keep changing. If we look at the last century of American politics, let's look at this a little bit more closely. Remember that after laissez-faire economics, that was the trigger of the Great Depression. John Maynard Keynes sat down to write a new economics, but what he really gave us was a restoration story. And it went something like this. Disorder afflicts the land, caused by the powerful and nefarious forces of the economic elite, which has captured the world's wealth. But the hero of the story, the benevolent state, will contest that disorder by regulating those forces and redistributing its wealth. Spending public money on public goods will overthrow these forces and restore harmony to the land. And like any good restoration story, this one had strong support across the nation because it fit with people's actual experience. But then Keynesianism began to run into trouble in the 1970s, and the neoliberals, people like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, developed a new restoration story. It sounded something like this. Disorder afflicts the land, caused by the powerful and nefarious forces of the overreaching state, whose collectivizing tendencies have crushed our freedom and opportunity. And so the hero of the story, the entrepreneur, will fight those powerful forces, roll back the state, create wealth and opportunity, and restore harmony in the land. Also largely embraced because it fit people's experience. Notice how these are two, it's the same narrative, but opposite stories with opposite heroes, opposite nefarious forces. So then we come to 2008, where neoliberalism falls apart, and its opponents come forward with what? Blank faces, because they've come up with nothing, right? We had Occupation Wall Street, we've had Black Lives Matter, we've had lots of deconstructing of the former stories, which has given some amazing energy. It's raised our consciousness in very amazing and important ways, but there is no compelling restoration story. When there is no compelling restoration story for us to gather around, we become stuck. And when we're stuck, our creativity and our imagination begins to fail us. And when imagination fails, despair is not far behind. We have rampant despair right now, not just because of the pandemic, but if you look at the statistics about suicide and overdoses, you recognize that there is a nationwide sense of despair because we have no restoration story right now. And if we don't have a story that describes our current situation, if we cannot therefore identify heroes, then our hope begins to evaporate. And when hope evaporates, what do? We turn against one another. And we begin fighting over which of those two outdated stories is less damaging. So I am not an economics person. So I say this with some asking some forgiveness for not being an expert about how or what our next narrative should be. But I think we can all begin to identify what the powerful and nefarious forces might be, and maybe then we could turn to who the heroes might be. I want us to begin to go beyond political parties, because I know when I start thinking about nefarious forces, I start thinking about a particular political party. But here's the thing. Each of our political parties right now is attached to one of those outmoded stories, right? I think we need another one. And I do believe there's a new story waiting in the wings. I call it the politics of belonging. And this story is based on the convergence of finding from a number of different sciences, including psychology, anthropology, and neuroscience, and that is that they have shown that human beings, by and large, have an amazing capacity for cooperation and an amazing capacity for altruism. I know we also have some greed and selfishness within us, but as it turns out, our most dominant features are cooperation and altruism. Our launch pad for those attributes is a sense of belonging. You see, those attributes are strongest when the scale of relationships are such that we have a sense of belonging with one another. When I was trained in community organizing, one of the first things that our facilitator did was he drew a huge circle on some newsprint, and then he divided that circle into three wedges. And on one of the wedges, he wrote government. On the second, he wrote corporations and businesses. And on the third, he wrote us. Us, as in collective action as citizens. And he said that when those three entities are in proper balance and alignment, we have a healthy democracy. Healthy democracy. It takes a lot of participation, but a healthy democracy means that we strengthen that third wedge. Organizing our communities, like you just described in your neighborhood. The community organizing approach is based on the recognition that as individuals, we have very little power, but as groups, we can actually influence both corporations and government. And faith-based community organizing has the added benefit that we don't have to apologize for saying we have a moral obligation to do thus and thus, or an ethical, or say that ethical treatment requires this. We can do that as people of faith. So what I want us to get a sense of this morning is that for the last 100 years, we've vacillated between which is most important, corporate life or government life, and which do we turn to for strengthening our common lives together? But the third wedge, I think, is the answer to a new restorative narrative, a new compelling story. And it might sound something like this. Disorder afflicts the land, caused by the powerful and nefarious forces of people who keep telling us that society is dead, that participating in our neighborhoods, in volunteer organizations, participating in local collective action is a waste of our time and energy. And that therefore the best we can do is fight tooth and nail as individuals to get what we need. But we, as heroes of this new story, will fight these forces by building richer, more engaging, inclusive, and generous organizations and communities where we live. We will get close to each other again in public spaces in order that we can witness one another's altruism and cooperation, so that prosperity can be measured in terms of the quality of our common lives, so that security can be seen as a result of strong neighborhoods of mutual trust and caring. We will build a stronger sense of belonging to stave off despair. And in doing this, we will restore harmony to the land. This is what a mature, participatory democracy would look like. Now, no restoration story can bring about lasting peace. There is, after all, always a counterpoint to our good natures that all religions warn us about. But the fact of our brokenness should never reconcile us to our present life. We can be the heroes of this new story each time we build bridges of solidarity, each time we refuse to buy into the current story of division and fear, each time we recommit ourselves to that which we belong to. In the words of Reverend Gretchen Haley, we are keepers of hope, holders of memory, storytellers, and song weavers, pulling on this thread of truth, this other march of history. Life is filled with kindness. It is filled with bold beauty, courageous compassion, sacrifice for the common good, and a wide willingness to embrace neighbors and strangers as kin. May it be so, and blessed be.